In the dusty archives of the Royal Library of Copenhagen, Dr. Elena Christensen made a discovery that would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about medieval Scandinavian history. As she carefully examined a 12th century manuscript that had been misfiled for decades, she realized she was holding evidence of what might be the most elaborate historical fabrication ever perpetrated. The manuscript, written in Latin by a monk named Brother Aldrich, contained a startling confession. "We have created these tales of the fierce Northmen to strike fear into our enemies and to glorify our ancestors who were nothing more than simple farmers and fishermen." The document went on to detail how a group of medieval scholars, working under the patronage of various European courts, had systematically invented the entire Viking mythology. Dr. Christensen's hands trembled as she read further. The confession described how the image of horned helmets, long ships, and berserker warriors had been crafted from a combination of earlier Celtic and Germanic folklore, mixed with deliberate embellishments designed to create a terrifying reputation for the Scandinavian peoples. The real inhabitants of medieval Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, according to Brother Aldrich, were peaceful traders and farmers who rarely ventured far from their homes. The implications were staggering. If this document was authentic, it meant that centuries of historical scholarship had been built upon a foundation of lies. The legendary raids on monasteries, the exploration of North America, the conquest of England, all of it could be elaborate fiction. As word of Dr. Christensen's discovery spread through academic circles, a small but growing group of historians began to re-examine the evidence for Viking existence with fresh eyes. What they found was deeply troubling. Professor James MacLeod of Edinburgh University was among the first to support Dr. Christensen's findings. His analysis of supposedly Viking artifacts revealed inconsistencies that had been overlooked for generations. When you strip away the romantic narratives and examine the physical evidence objectively, Professor MacLeod explained to his incredulous colleagues, you find a pattern of historical manufacturing that spans centuries. He pointed to the famous Viking ship burials, which upon closer inspection appeared to have been constructed using techniques that post-dated the supposed Viking era by several hundred years. The wood samples, when subjected to advanced carbon dating techniques unavailable to earlier archaeologists, consistently showed dates from the 13th and 14th centuries, not the 8th through 11th centuries traditionally associated with the Viking Age. The archaeological evidence that had long supported Viking existence began to crumble under scrutiny. The famous Oseberg ship, discovered in Norway in 1904 and long considered one of the finest examples of Viking craftsmanship, was revealed through new analysis to contain iron nails manufactured using techniques not developed until the late medieval period. Similarly, the Gokstad ship showed signs of having been artificially aged and buried as part of an elaborate hoax. Dr. Christensen's research led her to uncover a network of medieval forgers who had spent generations creating false evidence to support the Viking narrative. These forgers, she discovered, were not random criminals, but educated men working under the direction of powerful nobles who had much to gain from claiming descent from fierce warrior ancestors. The political motivations became clear when she traced the genealogies of the families who sponsored these forgeries. They were invariably seeking to legitimize their claims to power or territory. The linguistic evidence proved equally damaging to the traditional Viking narrative. Old Norse, the language supposedly spoken by Vikings, showed clear signs of being a constructed language, created by combining elements of various Germanic dialects in ways that no natural language would develop. Dr. Sarah Lindqvist, a specialist in historical linguistics at Stockholm University, conducted a comprehensive analysis of Old Norse texts and found patterns that suggested deliberate artificial construction rather than organic linguistic evolution. Natural languages develop irregularities, exceptions, and inconsistencies over time, Dr. Lindqvist explained. But Old Norse is suspiciously regular, as if someone sat down and created a language according to logical rules rather than allowing it to evolve naturally through centuries of use. Her computer analysis revealed that the vocabulary of Old Norse contained borrowed words from languages that should not have been in contact during the supposed Viking era, suggesting that the language was created much later by scholars with access to a wider range of linguistic sources. The famous Viking sagas, long considered primary sources for understanding Viking culture and history, came under intense scrutiny. These epic tales, which had captivated readers for centuries with their stories of brave warriors and epic voyages, began to reveal their true nature as carefully crafted fiction. Dr. Christensen's team discovered evidence that many of the sagas were written in the same hand, despite being attributed to different authors across different time periods. The paper, ink, and writing styles all pointed to a coordinated effort to create a comprehensive mythology. Even more damning was the discovery of what appeared to be the original outlines and character notes for many of the saga protagonists. These documents, found in the same archive as Brother Aldrich's confession, read like the notes of a fantasy novelist rather than historical records. Characters like Ragnar Lothbrok and Eric the Red were revealed to be fictional creations, carefully designed to embody different aspects of the warrior ideal that the forgers wanted to promote. The runes themselves, the ancient writing system supposedly used by Vikings, came under suspicion. Runologist Dr. Magnus Eriksson made the shocking discovery that many of the oldest runic inscriptions showed signs of having been carved with metal tools that were not available in Scandinavia until centuries after the supposed Viking Age. The wear patterns on the stones were inconsistent with natural aging, and chemical analysis revealed that many had been treated with artificial aging agents. What we're seeing is evidence of a massive, coordinated effort to create physical proof for a fictional past, Dr. Eriksson reported to a stunned conference of his peers. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to make these inscriptions appear ancient, but modern forensic techniques can detect the deception. The maritime evidence that had long supported the idea of Viking seafaring prowess also began to collapse. Marine archaeologists re-examining supposed Viking shipwrecks found that the construction techniques and materials used were far more advanced than what should have been possible during the supposed Viking era. The sophisticated understanding of hull design, sail configuration, and navigation techniques attributed to Vikings actually reflected knowledge that wasn't developed until the later medieval period. Dr. Emilia Torres, a maritime historian specializing in medieval shipbuilding, conducted extensive research into the evolution of naval technology and found a glaring gap where Viking innovation should have appeared. The technological leap attributed to Viking shipwrights is simply too dramatic to have occurred naturally, she concluded. It's as if someone took advanced shipbuilding techniques from the 13th century and retroactively attributed them to an earlier period. The economic evidence proved equally problematic for traditional Viking narratives. The vast trade networks supposedly established by Viking merchants would have required sophisticated financial instruments and record-keeping systems that left no trace in the historical record. Dr. Heinrich Müller, an economic historian at the University of Vienna, analyzed medieval trade patterns and found no evidence of the extensive commercial activity that Viking trade would have generated. Medieval trade was carefully documented by merchants, tax collectors, and port authorities, Dr. Müller explained. If Vikings had been conducting the kind of extensive trade operations described in traditional histories, we should have extensive records from their trading partners. Instead, we find a suspicious absence of documentation that suggests these trading relationships never existed. The genetic evidence that many had hoped would finally settle the question proved to be the most devastating blow to the Viking narrative. Dr. Lisa Chun, a population geneticist at the Institute for Evolutionary Biology, conducted extensive DNA analysis of populations across Scandinavia and the British Isles, looking for the genetic signatures that Viking migrations should have left behind. What she found contradicted centuries of accepted history. The genetic patterns we observe in these populations show no evidence of the large-scale population movements that Viking raids and settlements would have caused, Dr. Chen reported. Instead, we see gradual, peaceful mixing that's consistent with normal trade and intermarriage over extended periods. There's simply no genetic signature of the violent conquests and massive population displacement that the Viking narrative requires. The DNA analysis also revealed that many of the human remains found in supposed Viking graves were of local origin, not Scandinavian. This finding undermined the interpretation of these burial sites as evidence of Viking presence and suggested instead that they were elaborate hoaxes created by burying local individuals with artificially aged Scandinavian-style grave goods. As the evidence mounted, a disturbing picture began to emerge of how the Viking myth had been perpetuated across the centuries. The forgery operation had not ended in the medieval period, but had continued, with each generation adding new discoveries to support the established narrative. Renaissance scholars, Enlightenment historians, and even modern archaeologists had unknowingly participated in perpetuating and expanding the deception. Dr. Christensen's investigation revealed that many of the most famous Viking discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries have been staged. The Kensington runestone, long suspected of being a hoax, was just the tip of the iceberg. Entire archaeological sites had been carefully prepared with planted artifacts, and teams of archaeologists had been unknowingly documenting elaborate forgeries. The motivations behind this centuries-long deception gradually became clear. The Viking myth had served various political purposes throughout history. Medieval rulers had used it to legitimize their power by claiming descent from fierce warriors. Later, emerging nation-states had employed it to foster national identity and pride. In the modern era, the tourism industry had billions of dollars invested in maintaining the romantic appeal of Viking heritage. The revelation that Vikings never existed forced historians to completely reconsider the medieval period in Northern Europe. Without the disruptive influence of Viking raids, the development of European civilization took on a very different character. The supposed Viking attacks on monasteries, which had long been blamed for setting back intellectual and cultural development, were revealed to be fiction. This meant that the medieval period in Northern Europe had been far more peaceful and prosperous than previously believed. The real history of medieval Scandinavia, as it emerged from Dr. Christensen's research, painted a picture of sophisticated agricultural communities with extensive trade networks based on cooperation rather than conquest. These communities had developed advanced farming techniques, built impressive wooden architecture, and created beautiful decorative arts, but they had done so as peaceful peoples, not as the fierce warriors of Viking mythology. The social implications of these discoveries extended far beyond academic circles. Modern Scandinavian identity had been built partly on pride in Viking heritage. Tourist industries in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland faced the prospect of losing billions in revenue from Viking-themed attractions. Museums around the world found themselves displaying elaborate forgeries, and publishers faced the daunting task of revising countless history books. Religious historians also had to reconsider their understanding of early medieval Christianity. The narrative of brave Christian monks being martyred by pagan Viking raiders had played a significant role in Christian historiography. Without this persecution narrative, the spread of Christianity in Northern Europe appeared to have been a much more gradual and peaceful process than previously understood. The impact on popular culture was equally dramatic. Countless novels, films, television shows, and video games have been based on Viking mythology. The entertainment industry found itself in the position of having built an entire genre around fictional characters and events. While some argued that Vikings could continue to exist as fantasy figures, others worried about the broader implications for how society distinguishes between historical fact and fiction. Educational institutions faced the enormous challenge of rewriting curricula that had included Viking history as established fact. Teachers who had spent years developing lessons about Viking exploration, warfare, and culture suddenly found themselves having to explain to students that these topics were based on elaborate historical fiction rather than factual events. The scientific community struggled with questions about how such a massive deception could have persisted for so long. The peer review process, which was supposed to catch errors and fraud in historical research, had failed spectacularly. This led to calls for more rigorous standards in historical scholarship and better integration of scientific dating and analysis techniques into archaeological practice. Legal implications also emerged as various groups realized they had been unknowingly perpetuating fraud. Museums that had charged admission to view fake Viking artifacts faced potential lawsuits from visitors who felt they had been deceived. Publishers who had sold history books containing false information worried about their legal liability. Even academic institutions wondered whether they could be held responsible for graduating historians who had unknowingly been taught false information. The international diplomatic implications were also significant. The modern nations of Scandinavia had built part of their cultural diplomacy around shared Viking heritage. Cultural exchange programs, international festivals, and tourism agreements all had to be reconsidered in light of the revelation that this shared heritage was fictional. As the initial shock of Dr. Christensen's discoveries began to fade, historians started the long process of reconstructing what had actually happened in medieval Scandinavia. Archaeological teams returned to sites that had been interpreted as Viking settlements, approaching them with fresh perspectives and new questions. What they found was evidence of sophisticated agricultural communities with advanced techniques for dealing with the challenging Northern European climate. These communities had developed innovative methods for food preservation, had created complex systems for managing forests and livestock, and had built extensive trade networks based on trust and mutual benefit rather than conquest and pillage. The real medieval Scandinavians emerged as skilled craftspeople, innovative farmers, and peaceful traders who had made significant contributions to European development without resorting to the violence attributed to their fictional Viking counterparts. The revision of historical understanding also revealed that many technological and cultural innovations previously attributed to Vikings had actually originated with these peaceful communities. Advanced shipbuilding techniques, sophisticated metalworking, and innovative approaches to governance had all developed organically within these agricultural societies. The Viking myth had actually obscured and minimized the real achievements of medieval Scandinavian peoples. Dr. Christensen's work continued to uncover new evidence of the systematic nature of the historical forgery. She found documentation of a sophisticated network of scholars, artisans, and nobles who had coordinated their efforts across centuries to maintain and expand the Viking mythology. These individuals had been motivated by various factors: political power, financial gain, national pride, and in some cases, simply the desire to create a more exciting version of history than the peaceful agricultural reality. The techniques used by these historical forgers proved to be remarkably sophisticated. They had developed methods for artificially aging metal objects, for creating convincing replicas of ancient writing materials, and for staging archaeological sites that would pass casual inspection. In some cases, they had even gone so far as to create entire fictional genealogies connecting medieval nobles to imaginary Viking ancestors. As historians worked to separate fact from fiction in Scandinavian medieval history, they discovered that the real story was in many ways more remarkable than the Viking mythology. The peaceful agricultural communities of medieval Scandinavia had developed sustainable farming practices that modern environmentalists could learn from. They had created systems of governance based on consensus and cooperation that challenged traditional assumptions about medieval political structures. These discoveries forced a broader reconsideration of medieval European history. If the disruptive influence of Viking raids had been fictional, then the development of medieval civilization needed to be understood in new ways. The supposed Dark Ages began to appear less dark, and the intellectual and cultural achievements of the medieval period seemed more impressive when viewed without the shadow of constant warfare and disruption that the Viking myth had cast over them. The revelation that Vikings never existed ultimately proved to be liberating for historical scholarship. It demonstrated the importance of questioning established narratives, no matter how well accepted they might be. It showed the value of applying modern scientific techniques to historical questions and highlighted the need for constant vigilance against the perpetuation of false information, even in academic contexts. As Dr. Christensen reflected on her discovery and its implications, she realized that the Viking myth had served as a cautionary tale about the power of compelling narratives to override factual evidence. The story of fierce warriors from the north had been so appealing, so perfectly suited to human fascination with adventure and conflict, that it had persisted for centuries despite the lack of solid evidence to support it. The absence of Vikings from history did not make the medieval period less interesting or significant. Instead, it revealed a different kind of human achievement, the ability of peaceful communities to thrive and develop sophisticated cultures without resorting to conquest and violence. The real legacy of medieval Scandinavia was not one of fearsome warriors, but of innovative farmers, skilled craftspeople, and wise leaders who had built sustainable societies adapted to their challenging environment. In the end, the greatest lie in history turned out to be not just about Vikings, but about the assumption that progress and achievement require conflict and conquest. The peaceful agricultural communities of medieval Scandinavia had achieved remarkable things through cooperation, innovation, and careful stewardship of their environment. Their true story, once revealed, offered lessons that were far more relevant to the modern world than the fictional tales of Viking warriors ever could have been. The discovery forced humanity to confront uncomfortable questions about why violent mythologies are often more appealing than peaceful realities, and why societies consistently choose to celebrate fictional warriors over real innovators and builders. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Viking deception was not about medieval history, but about the present-day need to critically examine our assumptions and to value cooperation and sustainability over conquest and destruction. 10-06 The academic world was still reeling from the implications when Dr. Christensen made her next groundbreaking discovery. While cataloging the remaining documents in Brother Aldrich's collection, she uncovered what appeared to be the original planning documents for the Viking deception. These manuscripts, written in a mixture of Latin and early Germanic dialects, revealed the shocking scope and sophistication of the conspiracy. The documents detailed a meeting held in the monastery of St. Gallen in 1147, where representatives from various European courts had gathered to address what they called the problem of northern legitimacy. The northern European kingdoms, these documents revealed, were facing a crisis of credibility in their dealings with the more established powers of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. Their rulers were seen as provincial farmers lacking the martial heritage that commanded respect in medieval politics. Brother Aldrich's records showed that the solution proposed was audacious in its scope, the complete fabrication of a glorious warrior past for the Scandinavian peoples. The plan called for the systematic creation of artifacts, stories, and even archaeological sites that would establish the northern kingdoms as descendants of fierce, seafaring warriors who had terrorized Europe for centuries. The irony was that the very sophistication required to execute such a deception demonstrated the advanced organizational and intellectual capabilities that the conspirators claimed their ancestors lacked. Dr. Christensen found detailed instructions for artisans tasked with creating ancient weapons and jewelry. These documents included precise specifications for aging techniques, including the use of specific acid solutions to create authentic-looking corrosion patterns on metal objects. The forgers had even developed methods for artificially weathering stone carvings to make them appear centuries older than they actually were. Most remarkably, they had created detailed style guides to ensure consistency across all fabricated artifacts, establishing the distinctive visual aesthetic that scholars would later recognize as authentically Viking. The conspiracy extended far beyond simple artifact creation. Brother Aldrich's records revealed a sophisticated propaganda campaign designed to plant Viking stories throughout European chronicles and legends. Scribes were dispatched to monasteries across the continent with instructions to insert references to Viking raids into existing historical documents. These insertions were done so skillfully that they appeared to be original parts of the texts, complete with appropriate linguistic styles and historical context. Professor MacLeod's continued research into the physical evidence revealed even more disturbing findings. Using ground-penetrating radar and advanced soil analysis, his team discovered that many famous Viking burial sites showed clear evidence of having been excavated and refilled in the medieval period, centuries after the supposed burials had taken place. The soil layers told a story of deliberate archaeological staging, with artifacts carefully placed and bodies positioned to create convincing tableaus of ancient burial practices. The Sutton Hoo burial site in England, long considered one of the finest examples of early medieval warrior culture, proved to be perhaps the most elaborate of these staged archaeological scenes. Detailed analysis revealed that the famous helmet and weapons had been buried together only in the 13th century, and that the burial chamber itself had been constructed using architectural techniques not developed until the late medieval period. The entire site appeared to have been created as a showpiece to convince English nobles of their connection to a glorious warrior tradition. Dr. Christensen's linguistic analysis expanded beyond Old Norse to examine the broader pattern of how Viking-related terms had entered European languages. She discovered that words supposedly derived from Old Norse had actually been artificially inserted into various languages during the medieval period through the work of scholarly networks connected to the original conspiracy. These linguistic implants were so skillfully done that they had fooled generations of etymologists into believing in the authenticity of Viking cultural influence. The conspiracy's reach extended to the creation of entire fictional genealogies connecting medieval noble families to imaginary Viking ancestors. Dr. Christensen uncovered the workshop where these false family trees had been produced, complete with detailed character descriptions and invented historical events. The genealogies were works of remarkable creativity, featuring intricate plots worthy of modern fantasy novels, but they had been presented as historical fact and accepted as such for centuries. The economic analysis conducted by Dr. Mueller revealed the full financial scope of the conspiracy. The forgers had not only created artifacts and stories, but had established entire fake trade routes and commercial relationships to explain how Viking goods and culture had spread throughout Europe. They had even gone so far as to create false archaeological evidence of trading posts and merchant settlements in locations where Vikings supposedly had conducted business. Most shocking was the discovery that the conspiracy had included the deliberate destruction of authentic historical evidence that contradicted the Viking narrative. Brother Aldrich's confession detailed how original documents describing the peaceful nature of early medieval Scandinavian society had been systematically removed from monastery libraries and destroyed. Artifacts that showed the true agricultural and craft-based nature of Northern European culture had been melted down or buried to prevent them from contradicting the warrior mythology. The genetic research led by Dr. Chun took on new significance as she expanded her analysis to include populations across a wider geographic area. Her findings revealed that the supposed Viking diaspora had left no genetic trace anywhere in Europe. Populations in areas supposedly settled by Vikings showed no Scandinavian genetic markers beyond what would be expected from normal, gradual migration and trade over centuries. The absence of genetic evidence for Viking expansion was so complete that it ruled out even small-scale raiding and settlement, let alone the massive population movements described in traditional histories. Dr. Chin's team also analyzed remains from supposed Viking burial sites and found that they belonged almost exclusively to local populations. In cases where Scandinavian genetic markers were present, carbon dating revealed that these individuals had lived centuries after the supposed Viking Age. This suggested that some burial sites had been created using much later Scandinavian migrants or visitors, their bodies deliberately buried with fake Viking artifacts to create the impression of ancient warrior graves. The technological anachronisms in supposed Viking artifacts became even more apparent as Dr. Eriksson's team expanded their analysis. They found evidence of metallurgical techniques that had not been developed until the Renaissance, woodworking methods that required tools not invented until the late medieval period, and textile production processes that were impossible without technologies unavailable to early medieval peoples. The sophistication of these anachronisms suggested that the forgers had access to the most advanced techniques of their own time period and had used them carelessly, assuming that future investigators would not have the technology to detect their deceptions. Perhaps most remarkably, the team discovered evidence that the conspiracy had continued to operate well into the modern era. Documents found in private family archives showed that descendants of the original conspirators have been actively maintaining and expanding the Viking mythology for over 8 centuries. They had influenced archaeological excavations, funded historical research that supported their narrative, and even established academic positions at universities to ensure that scholars sympathetic to the Viking mythology would continue to perpetuate it. The modern phase of the conspiracy had adapted to changing times with remarkable sophistication. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as nationalism swept across Europe, the descendants of the original conspirators had positioned the Viking mythology as a source of national pride for Scandinavian countries. They had funded the publication of popular histories and supported the Romantic movement's fascination with medieval warriors, ensuring that the Viking image became deeply embedded in popular culture. The conspiracy had even influenced the development of modern archaeology. Several major archaeological expeditions that had discovered important Viking sites had been secretly funded and guided by the descendants of the original conspirators. These expeditions had been conducted by legitimate archaeologists who were unaware that they were documenting elaborate hoaxes rather than authentic historical sites. Dr. Christensen's investigation revealed that the modern tourism industry's investment in Viking heritage was not accidental, but had been deliberately encouraged by the same families that had originally created the mythology. They had quietly funded museums, heritage sites, and cultural festivals, always presenting themselves as merely enthusiastic supporters of historical education rather than the architects of an ongoing deception. The scope of the financial investment in maintaining the Viking mythology proved to be staggering. Over the centuries, the conspiracy had involved the expenditure of enormous sums of money on creating artifacts, staging archaeological sites, funding research, and supporting institutions. The economic analysis suggested that the total cost of maintaining the deception had reached into the billions of dollars in modern currency, making it perhaps the most expensive fraud in human history. The psychological analysis of the conspiracy revealed fascinating insights into how such a massive deception could persist for so long. Dr. Sarah Williams, a specialist in cognitive bias and group psychology, found that the Viking mythology had become what she termed a self-reinforcing cultural narrative. Once established, the story had become so appealing and so deeply embedded in cultural consciousness that people actively resisted evidence that contradicted it. The Viking image satisfied deep psychological needs for heroic archetypes and cultural identity. It provided a compelling narrative of courage, adventure, and martial prowess that people wanted to believe in, regardless of historical evidence. This psychological investment in the mythology had made it incredibly resistant to factual correction, allowing the deception to persist even when evidence against it began to accumulate. Dr. Williams found that the conspiracy had succeeded not just because of its sophisticated execution, but because it had tapped into fundamental human desires for exciting and dramatic histories. The real story of peaceful agricultural development and gradual cultural evolution was simply not as emotionally satisfying as tales of fierce warriors and epic adventures. The conspirators had understood this psychological reality and had crafted their mythology to maximize its emotional appeal. The revelation of the Viking deception forced historians to reconsider how many other aspects of accepted history might be similarly fabricated. Dr. Christensen's success in uncovering the conspiracy had demonstrated that even the most well-established historical narratives could be elaborate fictions. This realization sent shock waves through the entire historical profession as scholars began to question other cherished beliefs about the past. The methodological implications were equally significant. The Viking deception had succeeded partly because historians had relied too heavily on documentary evidence without sufficient scientific verification. The conspiracy had demonstrated how skillfully forged documents and artifacts could fool even expert scholars when they were not subjected to rigorous scientific analysis. This led to calls for fundamental changes in how historical research was conducted, with much greater emphasis on scientific dating, chemical analysis, and other technological verification methods. The international academic community struggled to respond to the implications of Dr. Christensen's discoveries. Conferences were hastily organized to discuss how to handle the revelation that centuries of scholarship had been based on false premises. Academic publishers faced the daunting prospect of retracting thousands of articles and books that had perpetuated the Viking mythology. University departments worried about how to retrain faculty members who had spent their careers studying a fictional historical period. The legal ramifications continued to expand as more institutions and individuals realized they had been victims of a centuries-long fraud. Museums that had built their reputations on Viking collections faced lawsuits from visitors who demanded refunds for admission fees paid to view fake artifacts. Publishers of history textbooks worried about their liability for spreading false information to generations of students. Even governments began to consider legal action against institutions that had knowingly participated in perpetuating the deception. The cultural impact extended far beyond academic and legal circles. In Scandinavia, the revelation that Vikings had never existed triggered a profound identity crisis. National symbols, cultural celebrations, and tourist attractions all had to be reconsidered in light of the discovery that they were based on fictional foundations. Some communities faced economic devastation as Viking-themed tourism, which had provided crucial income, collapsed overnight. The entertainment industry found itself in an equally difficult position. Movies, television shows, video games, and novels based on Viking themes suddenly seemed not just historically inaccurate, but fundamentally dishonest. Some producers argued that Viking stories could continue as fantasy entertainment, but others worried that audiences would feel betrayed by having been unknowingly consuming fiction presented as historical drama. Religious communities also had to grapple with the implications of the discovery. The narrative of Christian martyrs being killed by pagan Viking raiders had played an important role in church history and theology. Without this persecution narrative, the spread of Christianity in Northern Europe appeared to have been a much more peaceful process, which had significant implications for how religious communities understood their own historical development. The educational establishment faced perhaps the greatest challenge. Curricula at every level, from elementary school through university graduate programs, had included Viking history as established fact. Teachers and professors found themselves in the difficult position of having to explain to students that what they had been taught as historical truth was actually elaborate fiction. This crisis of confidence in historical education led to calls for fundamental reforms in how history was taught and verified. The scientific community used the Viking revelation as a case study in how consensus can be wrong and how important it is to maintain skepticism even about well-established beliefs. The success of Dr. Christensen's investigation had demonstrated the value of applying rigorous scientific methods to historical questions and had shown how technological advances could reveal truths that had been hidden for centuries. As the immediate shock of the discovery began to fade historians started the slow process of reconstructing an accurate understanding of medieval Scandinavian society. What emerged was a picture of sophisticated communities that had achieved remarkable things through cooperation and innovation rather than conquest and violence. These societies had developed sustainable agricultural practices, created beautiful and functional art, and established peaceful trade relationships that had contributed significantly to European development. The real medieval Scandinavians proved to be far more interesting than their fictional Viking counterparts. They had developed innovative solutions to the challenges of Northern European climate and geography, had created complex social institutions based on consensus and cooperation, and had made significant contributions to technology and culture that had been obscured by the warrior mythology. Their true achievements in sustainable living and peaceful coexistence offered valuable lessons for the modern world facing environmental and social challenges. Dr. Christensen continued her investigation, uncovering ever more evidence of the conspiracy's reach and sophistication. Each new discovery revealed additional layers of deception and demonstrated the incredible dedication and resources that had been devoted to maintaining the Viking mythology across the centuries. Her work had not only exposed one of history's greatest lies, but had also provided a powerful demonstration of how truth could ultimately prevail over even the most elaborate and persistent deceptions.